Is this on? Ooh, okay. Welcome, everyone. I don't know if we can get like a thumbs up from the folks online that you can see and hear everyone. Maybe Emma is monitoring the chat, so we'll find out. Great. We love a thumbs up. And I'm getting some weird feedback up here. Hold on. Okay, that's better. Okay. Welcome everyone online and in person to Alumni Week and to our BEARCATS lead event. My name is Victoria Kuhlman. I'm the Senior Director of Alumni Engagement. Super excited to have all of you here as we kind of try this sort of hybrid alumni success event out. We have folks representing countries outside of the US, which is really exciting on the call. We have about 40 folks on the call who are not located in the tri-state area. And then we've got folks here in the room. So it's kind of cool. We're all here together. And I'm super excited that all of you are here. Wanted to share that Day of Giving just kicked off at noon and it'll run until noon tomorrow. So that's a great way for you to make an impact on a cause that you really love or care about here on campus. I also wanted to welcome some of our UC Foundation trustees. Here in the room, we have Ruthie Keefe, and on the call, we have Barbara Fant and Amanda Waite. So thank you all for being here, both in person and online. For those in the room, please feel free to get more food and drinks. We know that on-campus parking was a little bit of a adventure this morning, so we might have a few late comers. So please make yourself at home. And then I am delighted to introduce Gail Fairhurst. Gail is a distinguished university research professor of organizational communication here at UC. She specializes in organizational communication processes, including those involving paradox, problem-centered leadership, and framing. She is the author of 4 books and is also the co-author of the forthcoming The Rutledge Handbook of Organizational Leadership Communication. She has published over 100 articles and chapters in management and communication journals and books. She is a fellow of the International Communication Association, a distinguished scholar of the National Communication Association, and a Fulbright scholar. Dr. Fairhurst lectures and conducts workshops on such topics as organizational communication, organizational change, organizational culture, organizational paradox, and leadership. Most often, she is called upon to discuss her 2011 and 1996 books, The Power and Art of Framing, regarding how leaders and managers can be taught to use language more strategically to manage change and other important aspects of their work environment. And on a personal note, I was lucky enough to sit through a few of Gail's classes as I was earning my master's in communication here at UC. And I find that I quote her work all the time. My brown nosing never stops, even after I've graduated. So we're super excited to have you here today. Everyone, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Fairhurst.
Okay.
And then it's the down arrow.
Oh, the down arrow to advanced. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. Great. And this is working? Yes. Okay. Very good. Well, it's a delight to be here. And brown nosing always works with me, Victoria. Just don't stop, dear. It really is a delight to be here because I have been a passionate advocate for talking about the value of communication throughout my entire career. I was just telling Ruthie earlier that our undergraduate majors hear from their fellow students that, communication is still the easy degree, right? You're getting a major in talking. Or sometimes I run into managers who essentially are pretty bright and generally articulate, but really largely unaware of how their language shapes context. And so that's really the genesis for the title of my speech if I'm talking, Am I Communicating? And I always like to begin with a story by David Foster Wallace. It's actually one that he told at Kenyon College for the commencement address. And the story goes that there were two young fish who were swimming along one day, and they happened past an older fish who looks at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" The two young fish swim on for a bit, and then one of them looks at the other and says, "What the hell is water?" And I think that's such a wonderful story to think about communication, right? And really taking communication for granted. So let me just ask you, how do you think of communication? Most likely, if you can think back to your college days, you probably learned about communication in terms of the sender message receiver model, right? It's very transmissional and very simplistic in its approach. If you're in a very authoritarian organization, maybe you think of communication as what your boss says is communication. But what I want to talk about today is a view of communication that is more meaning-centered. And it's about the creation of meaning, the negotiation of meaning, and the skill involved is the skill of framing. And that's what I'm going to talk about throughout today. So framing involves the ability to shape meaning, to choose one meaning over another when we communicate. And the link to leadership, I think, is an interesting one because Lou Pondy said this back in 1978, the dual capacity to make sense of things and to put them into language meaningful to large numbers of people gives the person who has it enormous leverage. And so the question becomes, how is it that you can think about leadership and how can you think about the totality of their communications really to emerge in that kind of way that we would attribute a leadership label to them? Let's just talk about a couple of great examples in history, first of all. And we'll talk about Dr. King and Abraham Lincoln. Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, we think about it generally every, once a year on the day everyone has off. But if you really look at the text of his speech, right, it's probably, one of the most vivid speeches for metaphor and imagery, and is widely regarded as probably the best speech of the 20th century. And it's with language like we see above, delivered in August 23rd, 1963, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, quote, "In whose symbolic shadow we stand today." He spoke of slaves seared in the flames of withering injustice. Used the extended metaphor of cashing a check for equal rights. And there's just a beautiful, beautiful set of paragraphs that elaborate on this metaphor. And of course, the often cited, "I look to a day when people will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character," right? Well, and I actually have my students read the speech. We look at a video of the history of the speech and the time so they understand the context of it. And so they understand that language is such a powerful view. What's interesting is a leadership historian by the name of Keith Grint in Britain said, well, what if we just did an executive summary of the I Have a Dream speech? And here it is. It's been 100 years since we were promised freedom and we still haven't got it. This state of affairs cannot continue. We must not sink to violent tactics, but we want freedom now. This isn't just a Black problem, it's an American problem. I have a dream that one day we will achieve our rights. Everyone go home and keep up the good work. Right? I mean, that's basically what the message is, but you compare that against the greatest speech in the 20th century, right? And you can begin to see that framing has such a powerful impact. And I love Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, delivered November 19th, 1863, after the Battle of Gettysburg during the American Civil War, in a dedication of the Gettysburg National Cemetery. 50,000 casualties during that period of time. And Edward Everett was the primary speaker for the day, delivered a 2-hour address just before Lincoln spoke. But that was actually pretty common during that period of time. But does anyone remember Edward Everett, right? We don't. But let's look at Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. 10 sentences, 271 words. And I'll just read the last sentence because that's the one that we remember. He says, it is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from this earth, right? Such a contrast, speaking for chairs, and 271 words, excuse me. So that takes us now, I think, to the skill of framing. And the way I like to introduce it is to use some research, excuse me for just a moment. To use some research by Barbara J. O'Keefe, who's a professor of communication at Northwestern University. And she's done about 25, 30 years of research on what she would call communication styles. And these are styles that essentially would indicate how sensitive you might be to framing as a skill. Okay, so we're really talking about how effectively you might be able to use language to paint a picture. And what this measure essentially suggests is that some of us are more sensitive to this kind of skill than others. Okay, so the first one is what we call an expressive. And the question I have for you is, do you know people who seem to lack an edit function? Okay, tell us about that, Kelly. What does this person do? Yeah. And sometimes they're not jumbled, sometimes they're just shocking, right? Sometimes they're funny, sometimes they're offensive, right? But essentially, these individuals probably are least sensitive to framing as a skill because the primary goal is simply to express themselves, right? Why did you say what you said? Well, that's what I was thinking. You know, that's what they say. They do edit messages occasionally, but only when negative consequences are really, really apparent. Ironically, Dr. O'Keefe's research suggests that it may be more trustworthy. Why would that be the case? Why would you think someone who is like your friend, open book, right? Not playing games, right? Exactly. Now, who on our national stage might fall into this category? I would argue Donald Trump, right? Now, please do know that I will be an equal opportunity critic on both sides of the aisle, so I just want to make that clear. But when Donald Trump tweets, I think we can see some of those at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, you know, pretty good indications of being an expressive. All right, the second type of style is probably where most of us lie, and that's the conventional. And conventionals see communication as a cooperative game to be played, right? You ask an expressive, why did you say what you said? And the expressive says, well, that's what I was thinking. When you ask a conventional, why did you say what you said? The conventional says, well, that's what is appropriate. And so essentially, the conventional believes that language is an expression in terms of the social effect one wants to achieve, right? And you essentially view the communication process as a cooperative game to be played. So if you're sitting next to at the table, a conventional and expressive, and a conventional says, are those the potatoes? The expressive is likely to say, well, yes, they are. But a conventional might say, well, would you like a potato, right? Because they recognize that the communication process is a cooperative game, and that was an indirect request. So it's good to be a conventional, right? Because you do have some sensitivity to framing, but there is a possible downside in the sense that a conventional might be merely reactive to the context. And let me talk about that in just a moment. But first, let me give you some examples. Most managers would fall into this category. I have in the past worked with a consulting group that's actually given paper and pencil measures to managers. So there's been some data behind this. but most managers would fall into this category. I would argue Bill Gates of the Gates Foundation falls into that category. Hillary Clinton, Al Gore, two presidential candidates who lost, but one of the reasons that they lost is essentially a reason that they share, and that they were probably overly coached, right? So Hillary Clinton's expression is that she doesn't know who she's pointing to, but the coaches told her to do that. And so the question is, might you fall into this category as well? Certainly my students in my 4,000 level leadership communication class mostly fall into this category as well. Now here's the context piece. So a conventional versus a strategic in this slide. So conventional would see the context as fixed, okay? A conventional would see the context as fixed. A strategic would see the context from multiple angles and thus open to shaping, right? People and situations are not fixed, rather they are created and negotiated through language. In difficult situations, the context and situation are redefined to be appropriate. Heightened sensitivity to language, the most sensitive to the framing concept. And in fact, my goal in class, or if I do executive coaching, is to move people more towards the strategic realm by being more sensitive to language choices in all aspects of their lives so that they can develop that appreciation for what language can do. The possible downside is probably not surprising, is sometimes they can appear manipulative, right? And if those of you remember Bill Clinton's problems as a president with Monica Lewinsky, and during the deposition for that was taken, a deposition was taken, and he was asked a question, and he answered the questions, and he said, well, it depends on what the meaning of the word is, right? Well, late night pundits skewered him because only a Rhodes Scholar, an Ivy League attorney, would be able to parse language in that way. And therefore, that was seen as more manipulative than it was really straightforward. So you can see with all three of these styles, they have both their strengths and those weaknesses, but the expressive is going to be least sensitive to the framing concept. The strategic is going to be most sensitive. Okay. Another example, Mark Andreessen, founder of Netscape, tells a story of a strategic with an idea that sounded preposterous. He wondered if social networking might help him defeat the overwhelming odds against him in the upcoming presidential election. This was 2007, and the strategic was Barack Obama, right? And this perfectly describes the strategic. It was like a guy in a garage who was thinking of taking on the biggest names in the business. What he was doing shouldn't have been possible, but we see a lot of that out in Silicon Valley. And then something clicks. He was clearly super smart and very entrepreneurial, a person who saw the world and the status quo as malleable. Okay. And of course, Obama is known for his rhetorical skills, and this is how we would essentially confirm that. Some strategics in society might be Martin Luther King, obviously. Steve Jobs in his lifetime would be considered one. Oprah Winfrey, I think, certainly is. Abraham Lincoln. And we also see some strategics who might have gotten into trouble a bit. And you saw, I think it was this past summer or several months ago, when the university presidents from Harvard, MIT, and American University testified before Congress, and it was the hot button issue associated with anti-Semitism and all of those issues. And they were asked a question related to, would you condemn that? And their answer, pretty much the same, was, well, it depends on the context. Right? And that answer did not fly, right? Because it seemed, you could understand it from a legal point of view, and there's probably lots of attorneys in the background, right? But you have to understand what framing does in terms of connecting with people. And that leads to my next slide. Is one of the things I try to do in my courses when I teach framing is to help individuals understand how their language and how their framing essentially shapes reality. And it sounds funny to talk about communication as reality construction. It sounds very abstract, But in fact, that's exactly what we're talking about, because effective framing is the ability to define the situation here and now in ways that connects with others. And what those 3 university presidents were not able to do is connect at that moment, right? And so that's what we're really talking about when we talk about framing, is the ability to analyze an audience and begin to understand how do you forge that connection. Through framing, we create the realities to which we then respond. Now, this might sound like something quite foreign, but I always like to use this example of, let's say that I came in this morning and started speaking Pig Latin as I started giving my talk. How would you all respond? You might wait a few minutes, right? Okay, all right. And then let's say now we're going 5-10 minutes. What are you doing now? You'd be confused, and you might also be angry, or you might just be, it's like driving past an accident, right? You might be rubbernecking, you might be kind of curious, right? Or what else are you doing? There's something else you're doing now as this is going on for a few minutes. There's something else you're doing. You're talking to one another, right? You're whispering, what's going on? You know what? This is bizarre, right? How could Victoria do this to us, right? And what you are essentially doing is trading interpretations back and forth, right? If you think, let's say, oh, she's putting us on, right? She's been giving speeches and doing training and working with executives for a long period. How could she be doing anything but? If you decide that I'm pulling your leg, maybe you give me a few more minutes and then you bolt, right? But if you decide, well, she could be losing it, lots going on in the university setting these days. She might be under too much. If you think I'm ill, if you think I'm having a breakdown, what are you doing? You just letting me talk up here? No, you're probably looking to Victoria, or Elijah comes up and say, it's okay, Dr. Fairhurst, we're going to take you back to your seat right now, right? But notice the interpretation of those situations are vastly different. If I'm pulling your leg, you bolt. If I'm sick, you pause, you take a moment, and you figure out how to get me help. And essentially what you've done is constructed 2 different realities because the situation is very ambiguous, right? And it is the ambiguity in that situation that allows people to frame things in very different ways. I would also argue that it is the ambiguity of the situation here and now that opens it up for interpretation, and thus is an opportunity to emerge as a leader. Because when you're working in teams and everyone is sort of confused as to what's going on, there's a lot of dynamism in the environment, a lot of complexity. Those individuals that seem to have figured that out and say, here's what I think, oftentimes are those individuals to whom you look to define the situation. Right? And so leadership emerges based on that. Some of the research in sociology says that leadership emerges when people speak early and often. Well, the communication view of that is not just early and often, but is able to make sense in a kind of coherent way over a period of time that people begin to look at you for that reason. So what are some skills or techniques? In my class, we talk about 3 in particular. First of all, how do you build mental models, complex mental models, because leaders who understand their world can explain their world. And there's some very interesting research from brain science that helps us understand how to build complex mental models. For example, the easy answer is we develop our mental models based on age and experience. Well, that makes sense, right? The more experience you have, let's say with me as a professor or as a friend or as a colleague, the more information you have about me in order to be able to design messages, right? But brain science says that the brain will reorganize itself with 2 things. One is incremental training that increases in complexity over time, and massive amounts of practice or immersion into the subject. Perhaps you have had a family member in the distant past who had had a stroke, and doctors used to think that brains were hardwired, right? And that you couldn't, once you've had a stroke, you couldn't recover that lost function, right? But we know that the brain will reorganize itself through incremental training that increases in complexity and lots of practice. We see this with military aircraft carriers. I'll think about this setting. I mean, this setting is, usually around 5,000, sometimes 7,000 individuals, most of whom are in their late teens and early 20s. And how is it that you're not getting airplanes, falling into the ocean? I mean, they're taking off and flying all kinds of weather, 24 hours a day. It's bizarre to really think about. Well, one of the things that they do is they don't assume that everybody all has the same knowledge, but they have overlapping knowledge throughout, okay, overlapping knowledge. And there's a control center, essentially, in the hierarchy that essentially fosters that kind of incremental training over a period of time and massive amounts of practice. And that's why Carl Weick, who is a very famous organizational scientist, calls high reliability organizations like these ships smart systems, because they essentially have figured out how is it that you develop a collective mind, right? And it's based on that overlapping knowledge and lots of practice and lots of incrementalism. What's also interesting about these particular organizations is that they are preoccupied with failure. That doesn't mean that they expect or want failure, but they argue that success breeds complacency, right? And if you are not preoccupied with failure, you're not preoccupied with what could go wrong, right? You're patting yourself on the back too much and you're not changing. So they're a fascinating kind of organization. And also one other point, and this will lead us to our next slide, is that the efforts that they engage in actually prime the organization for spontaneous performance, right? So you have all of that practice, and that is priming the organization for spontaneity. And that's the second technique for framing, is that understanding that the human brain is in fact plastic, right? It's a muscle, use it or lose it. And conscious recall leaves an unconscious imprint. There's so many interesting studies done on the subject of language priming now, money priming, all kinds of ways in which we prime ourselves in life, but we don't understand its power. And what brain science tells us is that we vastly underestimate the value of priming because we don't do it systematically. I mean, we think about the practice golf swing or the speech rehearsal or studying for a test, but we sort of blow that off, right? We don't understand that, in fact, what we are doing is using that time to essentially focus on something so that at some later point we can respond automatically. All right? There's been some fascinating examples about how high reliability organizations do that. And then the third technique with framing is to understand positive emotional contagion. You know, we used to think people listen with their ears, and now we say that people listen with their bodies. And why is that the case? Is because humans have a tendency to mimic the expressions of others. Right? So if an individual has very flat affect, if an individual appears ill or appears just very tired and worn, it's a very difficult time getting motivated by somebody like that, right? And so enthusiasm, expression, and facial expression is terribly important. High energy framing is instrumental to positive emotional contagion. Okay, so brain science has also told us then that this contagion is really a key factor in many work situations, and that's something that we tend to underestimate. Okay, so now what I'd like to do, I would like to switch to the interpersonal situation, because what I've just been talking about is what individuals can do. What happens when you are working in communities, working in organizations, working in teams, and how do you address the subject of reframing? Okay, and we live in an era these days where there's a lot of conflict. My way, your way are very, very different. We've got media cultures predicated on these different views. So there's lots of things going on in society emphasizing these differences. But if we could, let's go back to my comments about the three types of framing styles: expressive, conventional, and strategic. One of the things that we know is that when there is conflict and the styles agree, that is, an expressive is in conflict with an expressive, or a strategic with a strategic, then they're only just over the issues. But what Dr. O'Keefe's research has shown is that when the styles differ, there's conflict not only over the issues, but the style as well. So a strategic is likely to find the expressive rude, right? An expressive is likely to find the strategic manipulative. And so you can begin to see what has to be overcome in conflict situations when you've got these very different kinds of styles. So it's an important kind of thing to remember and to have that sort of third eye about when we're in the midst of conflict with someone. I really always try to insert some messaging about listening here, because when you're in the midst of conflict, listening is so important, and it is something that is just not done enough. And if I could show a quick video, this will give you some indication of that. And Victoria, will I just, oh, okay, all right. So let me just tell you what the video is. This is a Harvard professor who studies mother-infant interactions, and he has been doing this for decades and videotaping them. And he engaged, this is Professor Ed Tronick, he engaged in something called the still face experiment. And I want you to see what he says, and we'll talk about the implications for listening after we see this.
Right. I think I need to stop sharing.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you.
This young are
So happy it's happening to you guys.
responsive to the emotion. This young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
If you could get me back to the PowerPoint, that'd be great. What do you take away from this video?
So long as 2 minutes, I've watched the video.
The longest 2 minutes? Yeah. It was hard to watch. Yeah, yeah. Anybody else? Reaction? Great, yeah.
Class and being a mom at the time and being extra cognizant
Yeah,
of how my expressions are being received, and not only my kids, the macro lesson, but it just became extra sensitive to that concept and knowing how it
yes, yeah. And you can understand contagion, right? Right, because there is that wall that has gone up, right? And the baby is, she is mimicking what? There's nothing to mimic because it's a still face, right? And so that really, I think, drives home that we are listening with our bodies, not just with our ears. And that's such an important, I think, thing to understand when we think about how we frame a situation and how we are engaging with others to reframe a situation, right? And so one of the things that, I suggest is that, phrases like, "I hear you," reflecting back, "It sounds like," and I tell my students, if there's one phrase you take out of this lecture, it's "help me understand." Help me understand, right? And of course, in this video, I think we saw how the mother essentially scaffolds learning for the incident, right? So when the baby points, the mother will acknowledge that, right? But she'll also go one step a little further. She might say a word, or she might make a sound, or she might have a particular kind of face. And that kind of repeated scaffolding is how that infant essentially gets socialized. So listening is such an active, important kind of a skill to have. And I've actually, I have to tell you, had been in executive coaching situations where I've been brought in because the manager is just not a good listener. And you would think, well, how can that be? But in fact, observing him in a variety of situations suggested that if the conversation wasn't about him, he got up and left. And so he really wasn't interested in what other people had to say at all. So, that's, it's one of those skills that, or we might call it a micro skill in the framing process, one cannot underestimate. I just love this quote from Jon Stewart, not Jon Stewart, the comedian, but Jon Stewart, the PhD who writes about interpersonal communication. And he talks about bridges, not walls. He says, no matter what happened before and no matter how bad things currently look, you always have the option to try a next step. No matter how many times the same insult has been repeated, the next response can be creative rather than retaliatory. No matter how ingrained and toxic the pattern is that groups are caught in, the next move one side makes could be positive. And I just love that, especially given the era in which we're operating. But here's a really great example that you might appreciate. The British scientist Sir Tim Hutton, Nobel laureate, was reflecting on girls in the media in an interview. And he says 3 things happen when they are in the lab. You fall in love with them, they fall in love with you, and when you criticize them, they cry. On Twitter, it was Twitter at the time, the Girls of Science responded, filter mask protects me from hazardous chemicals and muffles my women cries, double win, hashtag distractingly sexy. I thought that was really good. And this one was really great. Yes, I know I'm distractingly sexy in my hazmat suit. The suit totally flatters my curves. And I thought that was just lovely. And one of the best responses I've seen was chronicled by Frank Bruni of the New York Times when Pope Francis was writing about the subject of gay priests. He said, Francis may not be telling the church's scolds that they have to relinquish their dogma, but his manner and diction are telling everyone else that he's not going to harangue them, that it's neither his inclination nor his place. And that's huge. Who am I to judge, he said. This from the Pope is like Streisand saying, who am I to sing? It's a bit of self-effacement you never saw coming. So I think this is another really great example of what Jon Stewart was trying to talk about. So what are some reframing skills? First of all, figuring out how to neutralize emotionally charged statements, right? If someone is really at a high pitch, how do you walk them down? How do you essentially bring that situation down? Something like, I can see you care deeply about this issue. Here's the one that really requires some really strong listening skills. Understand that most problems are not self-evident. Individuals often frame problems to justify the solutions they prefer. Okay. So if you have someone, for example, with a very autocratic style, it's very likely that they frame problems in a way like that's a crisis that will justify an autocratic response. And this is an interesting framing problem because of the complexities that this introduces. Consider mutual gain and a shift from an either-or argument to a both-and. I was talking with some of you with my connection to Marianne Lewis, Dean Lewis, over in the business school. We both do research in the area of paradox in organizations where we work at both at the individual leader level, but also at the system level. But the goal is to get leaders and managers thinking not just in terms of the either or knee-jerk reaction, but how do you get them thinking a little more complexly about how do we, reconcile both poles of attention. And I'm doing some interesting work with leaders trained in mindfulness techniques, believe it or not. And it appears that leaders who trained in mindfulness techniques, who are really more attuned to the present moment, learn how to pause, learn how to put a situation on hold, which is not a passive response, but is actually an active response, wait and see response, actually do better with responding to situations and getting that both and orientation than leaders who are not trained in mindfulness techniques. So it's very interesting to see how some of these things can be brought about today. And then finally, use humor, especially if playful, to disarm and open lines of communication. Individuals who are very, let's say, big, aggressive, domineering types can totally disarm audiences if they have some self-deprecating humor. So it's a powerful technique that we should all try to learn. So now, do you see the water? Thank you. Questions?
Get for those perfect relationships when it comes to,
Oh, God, no. No, I'm human being, so I fall prey to, to all kinds of foibles, but I try very hard. Although I have to say, I was telling Victoria that I was supposed to have my trainer at about this time, and my girls have warned him that I'm going to talk him out of giving me the hardest exercises. So I get into a lot of trouble associated with that. I tell you, one question I am asked about whether or not you're an expressive or a conventional or strategic is, can you be all three? Can you be all three? And the answer to that question is that if you are a strategic, you can act in a conventional manner and you can act in an expressive manner. If you are a conventional, you can act in an expressive manner. If you are an expressive, you're likely always an expressive. And the second question that my students tend to ask is, well, can you come from a family of expressives? And that is precisely the case. A lot of these students in my classes that are expressive say, well, my whole family's like that. And it seems that the norms for sort of violating communication, appropriateness are learned very early. And so that's what would make that more family-oriented as well. Yeah, okay. Okay, all right. Oh, here's one.
I think we're all familiar with the term reading the room. And so I think communication from leaders and the way that I perceive it is you need to be able to interpret the body language, the response, the energy of the space that you're in
Yes.
moving forward. And so what are some examples of positively reading the room versus negatively reading the room?
So, I think your experience level with an audience is really important, and your contact with the person who asked you is really important. So if you've done, like I had a pretty good indication who my audience might be, but if I had not, I would be really leaning on a Victoria, for example, to tell me what happened, tell me what with the last speaker, what's going on. Are there things that are just happening in the moment or just prior to that you might not be aware of? So, for example, in the 1980s, I was spent most of my free time and work time at Procter & Gamble collecting data. And they gave me permission to collect data there, but I had to travel to every plant to make the pitch to that plant, and then they would let me know whether they agreed or not. Well, I traveled to a plant in, I believe it was in Alabama, and I was not informed that the day before they had just had a really bruising union strike and contract negotiations. And that colored everything, absolutely everything. So I had attentive faces, but I happened to mention the word relationship contract, and that sent everything off the rails, and I was stunned by that. So that's an example of, you just have to sort of figure out what's going on. Reading the room in this day and age, in this political climate, not just in the state of Ohio, but nationally, is just terribly important. And so that's, we've got all kinds of division and also all kinds of media structures that reinforce that division. So it's, reading the room is terribly important. Yeah. Elijah.
You gotta do it so people online.
Tips on how to do that in a virtual environment?
Oh, that's tough. Again, lean on the person that invited you. I would say that's terribly important. Also, ask people to keep their cameras on. Okay. And if they're not keeping their cameras on, ask them again, because I think it's a totally different experience talking to individuals with the cameras on when, versus not. And I know that some people who work at home like to have the cameras off because they're still in their PJs. It was understood. But if you are, if you're the speaker, you really need to be able to do that. Yeah, yeah. What's that? I think so. Yeah, yeah.
Gail, when you're teaching your courses, do you see differences in the student from the beginning of the quarter to the end based on what you've taught them?
Oh, that's an ugly question, Ruthie. I don't see it so much. I mean, I see it in their testing, right? Because the content that I use builds, and I can see that they're answering questions in a more sophisticated manner at the end of the semester. But it's the feedback that I get after they get out. And so I hear from several students about how I use this or I use that, or there was this technique. That's probably the most valuable information that I get. But in the midst of it, I think they're more concerned with, sort of regurgitating content rather than, okay, has this really soaked in? Yeah, yeah.
Great. So this is a little bit like a part 2 of Elijah's question. So this person wants to know what advice you have on effective communication for those of us who work in virtual teams where you don't have the benefit of observing contextual cues.
Right. We used to think that relationships don't form via email or virtually, but actually they do, but it's a little bit slower process. And I think that some of the information that we're getting today is that you have to build a lot more redundancy into the communication process. You have to find ways to back channel when it's appropriate. If there's, let's say, a conflict emerge or something has to be settled a little bit more, or people want to fix something afterward. And so we're learning more about that. I think not going overly long. We have been told that, online meetings beyond about an hour are going to be pretty taxing for people. And so really trying to understand that process. And just in terms of even in-person lectures, some of the research suggests that going about 20 minutes before you break up the class to do something is terribly important. I mean, that's, when I started teaching, I mean, you could lecture for an hour and 20 minutes, and that was normal. But now it's really, I really try not to do that because students' attention span is just shorter. All of our attention span is a lot shorter, and they want to mix things up.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. We can do a round of applause for Gail.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Questions? We did that. Great. Okay, my one last shameless plug for those online who are in town and in the room. One big Alumni Week activity we have coming up is BEARCATS at the ballpark. So that's Saturday. The Reds did win yesterday, so our quest for the World Series this year lives on. But we will be doing a UC takeover down at Great American Ballpark. So tickets are still available. It is also Ellie De La Cruz bobblehead night, if that is important to any of you. But wanted to say thank you again to Dr. Fairhurst and for all of you being with us today here in person and online. Go BEARCATS.